What is up, Sooners Nation, and welcome to the Locked On Sooners podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thank you for joining me. My name is John Williams. You can follow me on Twitter at John9Williams. And joining me today is a good buddy of mine, Patrick Conn, who writes a lot of words about college sports, currently the site editor for the LSU Tigers Wire at USA Today, also overseeing some Auburn Tigers Wire, just all over the place. You can also subscribe to his Substack, the Reckham Report. Patrick got a lot of things to talk about, in particular, the college football playoff stuff that came down today or on Friday as we're recording this.
Yeah, the worst kept secret in college football, the fact that they weren't going to expand beyond four teams. I think that was expected by a lot of us who cover the sport. It was. I think a lot of it was wishful thinking, hopeful thinking, that they would expand to 8 teams to 12 teams. There was a lot on the table. But unfortunately, through the contract, which goes another 4 years, it looks like we're stuck with the same thing that we've done since 2014, 4 teams, and you just got to move forward from there.
I think where I fell on this was the wishful thinking, mostly because I think more football is fun. Like, more playoffs equals more fun. Now, there's the argument to be made that it doesn't really change much because we know who the top dogs in college football are, and they're going to stay the top dogs, whether you have 4 teams or 12 teams. But I think what an expansion did was just bring more people to the table, more people to the party, and provides more revenue for a lot of the conferences. Now, it was surprising that there were 3 conferences really that voted against it. I wasn't sure that they were going to be able to come to a resolution to pass expansion for the upcoming season, and maybe I shouldn't really be surprised at who voted against it, because we have the alliance, which may or may not actually turn out to be an alliance, maybe a soft agreement, so to speak. But the Pac-12, the Big Ten, the ACC were the 3 dissenting votes on the 11-member panel. Did that surprise you at all? What's your biggest takeaway from those 3 schools saying, "Nah, we're good with 4, whether or not we get participation in the playoff"?
I think a lot of that kind of conversation came about because of the changes, and we'll get into this later, with the SEC expansion, adding 2 more teams. Because ultimately, if you look at it with the amount of teams that the SEC is going to have, it's more opportunities for the SEC to control. If you look at the history, Alabama's in it every year. That is the team that's there every year. You've had teams like Clemson who have been there multiple times. You've had Oklahoma's been there multiple times. The one thing that we haven't really seen very often has been the Pac-12. Now, why is that? Well, the Pac-12 is completely down. They haven't really had a strong team, and it's a year in, a year out type of deal. You look at, in the Big Ten, it's typically Ohio State. Michigan made it this year, obviously. And, there was a lot of competition there with the Big Ten. You look at everything going on, but ultimately, I think those 3 teams kind of feel like it was more a benefit to the SEC than anybody else. Whereas if you're looking at it from where the SEC is, they really don't have a reason to expand beyond 4 teams because they have an annual team in there. Mind you, the SEC is also the only team to ever have multiple teams make the same college football field. Both times it was who? Alabama and Georgia. Who faced off in that national championship game both times? Alabama and Georgia. So ultimately, I was actually interested to see when Nicole Auerbach put out that tweet about who was actually voted for and who voted against. And you come to see that the SEC was on and voted yes for expansion. So I thought that was interesting, considering the perception has been that the SEC shouldn't want to, or maybe that they knew that the 3 conferences in the alliance were going to vote no on this. Because that's interesting. Because I think it simply boils down to this: not only the expanded field of 8 versus 12, but who gets those automatic qualifying bids. Yeah. I think that's a big part of it. Do all conference champions, and maybe they're looking out for like the group of 5. Do all conference champions get a spot? I mean, if you look at it, so you have the Power 5 and the group of 5, that's 10 spots, right? And then you have 2 other spots. So who's getting those? And I think ultimately that's what it boiled down to is they can't agree on it. There's a large part of me who thinks if they're doing college football expansion, we need to get more networks involved.
Mhm.
not just ESPN, because they control so much. And of course, they have the contracts with the SEC. They get the best games each week. It seems like when you look at the broadcast each week. So there's a lot of money tied in this for ESPN, but yet they're the only dog in this fight. So there's a lot of questions about maybe not only parity within the teams, but the networks. Get Fox involved, CBS. I think there was a lot to be discussed, and a lot more that we could discuss about it. Where are these games going to be playing? Are we going to have on campus games? Which brings more revenue to schools. How do they split that up? There's so many questions right now that we've heard about these meetings for months and years, and now essentially we've got 4 more years of conversations that can take place before we really get any resolution on a college football playoff that, like you said, wishful thinking, right? You were hoping for it. I guess I was more on the realist. I never saw the benefit of expanding.
Mhm.
If you look at it now, is there a benefit to expanding for the group of 5 and some other Power 5 teams? Absolutely, there is. But again, you look at the product that you're giving, and I know people will say you can get hot at any time, late in the season. We've seen this at the NFL level. Why wouldn't it happen at the college level? A team gets hot at the right time. I get that, but you look at a 1v8 matchup, which this last year would have been Alabama and Ole Miss. We'd already seen that matchup.
Right.
Do I want to see that again? Do I want to see Michigan and Baylor? Well, probably. I think that would be a good matchup. I mean, Baylor's got a really good defense against that high-powered offense that Michigan had last year with Josh Gaddis, who left, who's now at Miami. But that's the real thing. Is like people are looking. Do we end up with any different 4 teams than we have? Which is a big question. But here's the thing: we'll never know because we haven't expanded.
Right.
Any given Saturday. I mean, you could tell me that it won't matter, but a team that Alabama was expected to expose last year, Texas A&M, beat Alabama. It does happen. Michigan lost to Michigan State, but yet they still made it.
Mhm.
So I mean, I think it's questions to be had, but I think that's kind of the argument right
Well, I think you look at teams 3 through 12 from last year, and there would have been a ton of really intriguing matchups to get to the final 4, whoever that would have been. And this isn't to say that one of those teams could have beat Alabama, could have beat Georgia, but really in a 1-game playoff, you never really know what's going to happen. In a 7-game series in the NHL or the NBA or Major League Baseball, generally the best team is going to win. But in a 1-game playoff, a lot of weird things can happen. And an upset occurs. Now, it's unlikely, absolutely, but there could have been a lot of really fun matchups that take place. And I think to your point about the broadcast aspect, I mean, this is what the NFL has, right? They have 3-4 major networks involved in the broadcast of their playoffs and the regular season games, and it creates more revenue when you have more networks bidding on these games. This could be the long view, looking at, hey, if we wait until 2026 when we can actually expand this thing and we get CBS, Fox, ESPN, ABC, and whoever else, maybe Amazon Prime, bidding on these games, these playoff games, potentially our revenue just goes through the roof and it creates more money for the field that gets to play in those games. And I think maybe that's where I kind of find a little bit of surprise in this, because right now, this is still an opportunity for revenue for a Pac-12 school. Like the Pac-12 isn't going to make the college football playoff in most years because, I mean, they have a little bit of parity at the top with Utah, Oregon. I mean, USC, who's everybody is jumping on the bandwagon already and thinking they're going to make a playoff. I mean, they got a lot of work to do on that front, but I mean, it's a conference that beats up on itself similarly to the Big 12, maybe just not as talented, but I find it kind of unlikely they're going to make it. I mean, they've only had 2 representatives in the 8 years of the college football playoff, while the SEC has had 10. Like, if you're wanting your teams represented in the college football playoff, expansion is your best avenue. And I know that's the case for the Big 12 as well. Like the Big 12, it beat up on itself this past year and didn't get anybody in, even though they had some really good football teams that could have made some noise in a playoff. And, a defense that was as good as Baylor's. I mean, maybe they shut down a Georgia and keep it a close game. And who knows, a field goal here, a turnover there, and that's a football game. I don't know. But it just creates more fascinating aspects of college football and more interesting matchups that we're going to get to see. Like, I'm looking forward to this next season when Alabama goes to Austin to play Texas. Like, with realignment, you're going to get some really fun matchups that we haven't seen a lot of in the past. But with college football playoff expansion, we're going to get even more of that. And these games that we get these interesting matchups in for the bowl season, they're actually going to mean something. They're going to actually like have a little bit more juice to them because the games are going to matter more. But I think there's so much more to discuss on this, and I know, Pat, you've got a lot to say on it. But first, I want to talk to y'all about our friends over at Bet Online. Football might be over, hey, but it really never is over. It's always football season. But basketball is in full steam for both pro and college hoops. And betonline.net is the number one spot for all your sports betting needs. BetOnline remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. You can get UFC, boxing, hockey, even Olympic coverage over at betonline.net. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline is where the game starts. And Patrick, to your point, like I sent out a tweet over at John 9 Williams that listed the Power Five conferences, really the representatives for each kind of conference in the group of five. So the SEC had 10 teams make it in 8 years. Now, most of that's Alabama and Georgia. You had LSU jump up there one time. Then you have the ACC that had 7. That's Florida State and Clemson. The Big Ten was 5. Michigan State made it once. Yeah, Ohio State several times, and Michigan as well. The Big 12 had 3 representatives, all Oklahoma. And then the Pac-12 has made it just twice. And the last time they made it was the 2016-2017 season. So this is, I'm dumping on the Pac-12 a lot right now, but I think this is a problem also for the Big 12 in that like expansion is going to be a good thing eventually when it does happen for the Big 12. And I think it is going to be for the Pac-12. So like in my mind, even if the SEC or when expansion does happen, the SEC is going to be a strong bet to have 2 teams. And depending on the format and how the automatic bids work, they could get as many as 3 teams, but a lot of these other conferences could get a conference champion and an at-large bid in it as well. Like you look at the Big 12 this past season, if it's a 12-team playoff and say you have the Power 5 automatic bids, you get Cincinnati as a group of 5 bid, you get Notre Dame as an at-large bid in their independent status, potentially Baylor and Oklahoma State both make the college football playoff. So it opens up a lot of opportunities for every conference, not just the SEC.
Yeah, and I fully expect you to dunk all over the Pac-12 because I know you're still sore about Lincoln. But I gotta jab you a little bit. But you're right though in that the Pac-12 has been represented the least amount of times of any of the Power Fives. And as I stated, in our first segment, Pac-12 is down, right? Why do they go and get a coach like Lincoln? They need some juice in the Pac-12. They need USC to be good because it just makes that conference stronger as a whole. They need Oregon to be good, and they have been good. And obviously they lose their head coach. They have to go in a different route, but they need those 2 schools to be good for the simple fact to help them not only help their standing to get into the college football playoff, but they need to help bring up the Pac-12 because you have a team like Utah who would have been like right there in that 12-team playoff. And we saw them get hot late at the season. They beat Oregon 2 out of 3 weeks. So it's one of those things where I'm not sure a whole lot of teams would want to play Utah last year,
right?
Towards the end of the season. So that would be an interesting matchup because if you went by the 12, we would have got Michigan versus Utah. That might have been a really interesting matchup if you go by the final CFP rankings. Matchup of Georgia and Michigan State. I don't know that it would be that competitive, but I would have been really interested to see. But there's a key dynamic here to playoff expansion. When we talk about these bowl games and these players, last year we saw it with Kenny Pickett, and he opts out of a New Year's Six bowl game. It's the first time Pitt's been in New Year's Six in a while, and he opts out so he can prepare for the Senior Bowl, get ready for the NFL draft. Now, if he has an opportunity to play for a national championship, does he opt out of that game? There's a lot of these players. LSU had Damone Clark, one of their top defenders. I think he was top 4 in the nation in tackles. He was
Yeah.
among, the finalists for the Butkus Award, top linebacker. And he opts out for the game against Kansas State in the Texas Bowl. If LSU would have had a much better team and they were in the playoff contention, does he opt out of that game? I think no. A lot of these guys, you don't get an opportunity to play for national champion. Now, Damone Clark was part of that 2019 team. So, technically he has a ring, right? Because he spent 4 seasons there. But to have that opportunity to play for a national championship, maybe that changes some of these opt-outs. Now, I know the reason why they do it. Why risk my body for this game when it's a bowl game that doesn't really matter? Even if it is a New Year's Six bowl, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. And, you could have a situation we've seen so many times a player gets injured. How much money Matt Corral got injured in that bowl game. How much money did Jake Butt lose at Michigan for playing in that bowl game?
Yeah.
He dropped down spots because he tore his ACL. So I can understand it from that standpoint, but I also think if you expand, there's also the potential that those key players, those star players, I'm not going to say they won't, but maybe they're less likely to opt out because they have an opportunity to play for something. Yeah. Especially if you've worked, if you're in your 5th year in the program, like a Kenny Pickett, you worked your way up and he's got a chance to play for a national championship. He'd probably have to go up against Alabama. It'd be one heck of a fight, but I'd be down to watch Kenny Pickett versus Bryce Young, but that's one of those things that potentially can change a lot. And it's not just a playoff field, but who's playing in those games.
And I think it also just raises the kind of the national profile for a lot of these teams where, every year we're seeing the same, 3, 4, 5 teams, Alabama, Clemson, Georgia, getting in, Ohio State, getting into the college football playoff. Well, what does that do for them in recruiting? It just helps get them more big time recruits. You get a team like Pitt into the college football playoff playing for something at the end of the season. And maybe they don't win the thing, but maybe it gives them a little bit more juice with recruits on the recruiting trail saying, hey, look, we got into the playoff. We might have gotten beat by Alabama. We might've got beat by Georgia, but we were there. I think just that the idea that, hey, we were a playoff team, it just means, I almost just dropped the SEC. It just means more, but it just adds a little bit more to your team's resume as you're on the recruiting trail, where right now it's Alabama, it's Georgia, it's Clemson, it's Ohio State that are, for the most part, dominating a lot of that because their names are just everywhere. Like they're all over the place. And I think you're right. There are going to be far fewer opt-outs because how many NFL coaches are going to look at a player and if he opts out of a meaningful playoff game, are they going to look at that player a little bit differently? Now they might look at him a little bit differently if they opt out of a bowl game, but if there's something to play for and they're not hanging with their guys, they're not playing with their team, I think a lot of the old school mentality coaches are going to kind of knock that player a little bit, or scouts are going to knock that player a little bit. And so I think that does create an interesting dynamic because Oklahoma, we didn't have to see Kayvon Thibodeau out of Oregon because he decided to opt out of the Alamo Bowl, which, hey, do your thing, man. Go make your money in the NFL. But again, if that's a meaningful football game, Kayvon Thibodeau likely plays because that's just one more Power 5 team that he can get some tape on and potentially assert himself as the number 1 overall draft pick. Instead, who knows where he's going to land at this point as draft evaluations are happening. But I think this is just something that it's eventually going to happen. Me personally, I like the idea of, those first round games being on campus games just to create a little bit more revenue for the school that did make it. Even if they're not going to go far in the playoff, at least they get that one more home game bump. What do you think about that? Is that something that you'd be on board for?
Well, I kind of feel like the top 4 probably is my guess, or the top 2, just however it breaks down. It's probably the top 2 aren't going to have an on-campus game.
Right.
They're probably going to get a bye, where they get to rest up and get prepared. But, but those next 2, right? And that is an opportunity, not really the next 2, really it's the next, 5?
4. Yeah.
4 or 5.
Or 5.
That. So they're going to get, that, but, what's the revenue split? Treat it like a bowl game, right? Yeah. The ticket allotments for both sides built in, make it I think that would be great. How awesome would it be to, if you're, let's hypothetically, I'm not saying that they're going to be there, but hypothetically, how cool would that be to have a college playoff game at Darrell K. Royal? That's a great event.
Yeah.
A Penn State game, home playoff game. How great, is that? There's some historic places. We've seen playoff games out at the Rose Bowl. Obviously the Rose Bowl every year, but maybe some of these other venues that are maybe a little more historic. You could have these events at, and I think they can make it interesting. Having a home playoff game in Oklahoma would be interesting to see.
Yeah.
How many rival fans are going to show up for that game? And I would love it. I've covered both sides of the Red River rivalry. As you know, I've covered Texas, I've covered Oklahoma. I would be really interested to see what that split. Could they get a split similar to how the Cotton Bowl Stadium looks? For a college football playoff, because I think that's one of the most unique experiences in college football because of the split. But there's so many opportunities, so many places. A playoff game in Eugene, Oregon.
Yeah.
I think that would be fantastic. Or the shoe, the big house. There's so many places that I think that would be great. And I think ultimately, I'm sure we're going to get into this, but I kind of feel like the big losers are the fans because we're not getting those. Because I think ultimately that would be, because if you look at the college football playoff, typically you're using the same venues, obviously in rotation. But, it's like with these playoff games on campuses, it gives us another opportunity for a unique experience. And that's ultimately why I look at this and say that really the big losers here are the fans.
Yeah, I'd be 100% for getting rid of the bowl system and the neutral site aspect of any of the college football playoff games, because I just it's a lot like the Super Bowl, and then it loses a little bit of its luster when you're not packed out with fans who aren't paying thousands and thousands of dollars to be there. Like they're paying, maybe an increased ticket price, but not the ridiculous amounts that you're going to see for a college football playoff semifinal or the championship game. Like, yeah, you talked about it, a playoff game in Darrell K. Royal, at Tuscaloosa, in the swamp. Like, how those would be really, really cool events. I think that's one of the things that I'm looking forward to with SEC realignment for Oklahoma, is getting to go to places like that you may not have ever played, or getting to host a team like Alabama in Norman. I just think that's going to create such a huge atmosphere, such an energetic atmosphere for the whole town. And it gives a little bit of a bump to these college towns. Like how much more does Jerry Jones need at AT&T Stadium in Arlington by hosting a playoff game or a championship game? Like, and if you want to keep the neutral site championship game, that I'm totally on board with that. But go to the NFL model and just give the top seeds home field advantage for as long as they can stay in it. And if they get knocked off, then home field advantage goes to somebody else. I'd be on board with that. I think that'd be a lot more fun for everybody involved, for sure.
Yeah, no, and you bring up a good point about that. I think there's, I know it's totally getting off topic here, but I still think the championship needs to be a neutral site. Like, I still think there needs to be that. The other one, for me personally, I still would like to see the semifinals in these neutral spots, because I still think you need to have one at the Cotton Bowl, or the Orange Bowl or the Peach Bowl. I still think they still need to keep that, but the games leading up to the semifinals, I think, should be on campus. I think there should be at least one round of on-campus games. Again, it gives you a new experience. It gives you opportunity, like you said, like, being in the Big 12 and covering the Big 12 with Oklahoma, with Texas Tech, and those other teams. It's not often that you get to go to these venues.
Mm-hmm.
You go. How often do we hear about them playing in the swamp?
Yeah.
In Tuscaloosa, going to Death Valley, playing at Tiger Stadium.
Yeah.
Tiger Stadium is like, I'm gonna be honest with you, that's like one of the loudest places. When they're going, that is like the loudest college stadium that I have ever heard. Now, have I been to a lot of college stadiums? No, but it was extremely loud. I couldn't hear anything other than the just like screaming, and it was ridiculous. But to go to a game like at Tiger Stadium, that is an event that, or a memory, and you make memories. Like, this is a memory that you're gonna have. You're like, oh yeah, do you remember that time that the Sooners went down to LSU, Baton Rouge, for the playoff game? It's it's one of those things like you were talking about. Let's do the campus. It's a new event. It's a new memory. It's a new feel, and maybe it just ups the ante a little bit. Because I think we can all agree that the one reason why a lot of people are drawn to college football, it's the pageantry,
Mhm.
it's the passion. You don't really. I mean, you do get that to a point in the NFL, but it's nothing compared to college football. I
Right.
mean, it's just a level of passion that's unrivaled. And it's not just college football. We see it in college basketball. I mean, most recently, I'm just gonna prop my boys, Texas Tech versus Texas. The announcers were like, "This is the wildest like
Mhm.
college basketball regular season game I've ever been to," because of the crowds. But that's what makes the college game so great. And if you can bring that more so into the college football playoff with some of these events on campus, I think you got to do it.
Yeah. And yeah, do it for the first two rounds. Do it for the wild cards or the at larges, and then do it for that quarterfinal round where the teams that have a buys, just more on campus stuff, because it provides a lot more fire, a lot more energy to these games. And yeah, just be too much fun. I mean, I was looking back, I was doing a piece for Sooners Wire, and I was looking at some non-conference schedules. And the last time that Texas hosted Alabama was 1922, like 100 years ago. And that's crazy to me. These are two of the like preeminent college football teams in the history of the sport. And yes, they've played, but they played always at neutral sites since then. So like to get these type of games in their home stadiums, I think that just kind of just raises the profile of college football, and it creates more of an exciting atmosphere. So that's going to be a lot of fun. And eventually college football playoff expansion is going to happen. The fact that they're having the talks, even if they're delaying it now, it's going to happen 4 years down the road. They'll get a lot of these things figured out. They'll figure out the money, the revenue splits, who gets in, which teams get a buy, which are going to be at large bids, which are going to be automatic qualifiers. But it's going to be something to just anticipate. I think we're going to have a lot more anticipation for it when it comes to that point, because it seems like it's put off now till 2026. So we'll have 4 years to wait, and I think it'll be a lot more fun to talk about it when it does actually come to fruition. But a little bit more controversial college football news, in that the NCAA is now looking into NIL, something that I think everybody asked them to do for years now. And they decided to kind of put their heads in the sand and let the states deal with it. Now they're going to finally deal with it. We'll talk about that after I tell you about Built Bar. Built Bar is the best tasting protein bar ever. It's easy to eat, 100% covered in chocolate, and it tastes great. It's great for you. It's only got 130 to 180 calories, anywhere from 4 to 5 grams of sugar, 4 or 5 grams of net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. It's the protein bar that tastes like a candy bar. I love the coconut brownie chunk and the peanut butter brownie. Have one of those for breakfast pretty much every single day. You will not be disappointed if you go to built.com. Use promo code LOCKED15 to get 15% off your next order over at built.com. All right, Patrick, the conversation that everybody loves to talk about, and that's the NIL. What do you think about Caleb Williams' NIL deal with Dre's Beats?
Beats by Drake, go for it, man.
Hey
I
man, I thought that
mean,
was pretty cool. Like, I don't hate it. If you're gonna get an NIL deal, man, shoot, aim high, aim for the stars, and you got probably the biggest um conglomeration, in the Beats by Dre thing. Like, there's no headphone that's more recognizable than Beats. That's like the Jordan of headphones. So shout out to Caleb Williams for landing that one. That's pretty huge.
and then of course it doesn't hurt when the guy that Beats by Dre
Yeah.
is doing the halftime show at the Super Bowl. So I mean,
Right.
it's everywhere, right? And
Yeah.
everybody's talking about it. Yeah, I don't have a problem with it. Like, I actually love the fact that these guys are getting involved with it.
Mhm.
DJ Alphabet Soup, last name I'm not going to try and say, over at Clemson,
Yeah.
because I always mess it up. I mean, he was in Dr. Pepper commercials. The
Yeah.
fans bill. I love those commercials, by the way.
Yeah.
But he was doing those commercials, so he's Dr. Pepper, awesome.
Yeah.
If I'm a college athlete, I'm calling up Whataburger and I'm like, hey, can I get a deal?
That's
Can we
right.
do some commercials? Can I
That's
get some
right.
swag?
Yeah.
I mean, but I love the fact that these guys are able to cash in their name, image, and likeness. I absolutely love it. Like, I
Yeah.
hated so many times. I think like Todd Gurley got in trouble at Georgia for selling, pictures that he signed or signed jerseys and all this. And I'm like, it's their name. Let them, their name, image, and likeness. Let
Right.
them make some money off of it. And the NCAA, like you said, stuck their, head in the sand, and we're hoping Congress were going to step in and do something. And then they opened the Pandora's box, and now they want to put the genie back in the bottle.
Yeah.
I don't know if you I'm just going to read this statement, the opening statement I tweeted out today, and I thought it was ridiculous. We're concerned that some activity in the name, image, and likeness space may not only be violating NCAA recruiting rules, participating in those prohibiting booster involvement, but also may be impacting the student athlete experience negatively in some ways. I got a question, and this is totally facetious comment, but I'm gonna go ahead and say it anyway. If Texas A&M isn't rumored to be doing all this negative, all this illegal stuff, or paying guys, and they have the number one recruiting class, does the NCAA say anything? If it's Alabama that's doing it, do they say anything? Okay, it's a joke. I think they would say
yeah.
something.
No, I mean, there's a lot of places that there's, it's questionable, what's going on. But I can't imagine that these schools aren't operating within the bounds that have been set forth. Like Texas, hooking up their offensive line. Like, there's no way they're doing that publicly and not doing it within the boundaries that have been set before them.
Well, no, and we've seen these NIL collectives, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even Texas Tech has one, and it's head up by the one of the border regions. So, like, everybody's doing it.
Yeah.
Maybe because you allowed it.
Right.
See, that's the problem. Is now the NCAA, why are they having a problem right now? Because people are making money and they're not making money off of it. So now the NCAA is having a problem with it.
Yep.
I'm sorry, but the fact that now Mark Emmert, who's the biggest joke in college sports, has a problem with it, I don't have a problem with it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, we could get into a lot about NIL and, who does this favor? Does it favor the big schools with the big alumni bases? Yeah, it does, but that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
That's the way it is today. And like you said, the NCAA opened the floodgates. Then what happened?
Yep.
And now they're trying to go back and change the rules. It's like, you should have set the boundaries to begin with.
Right.
But you didn't want to deal with it. You pushed it off. You punted it to Congress. And when Congress didn't do it, now it's a problem.
Yeah. And it I don't know, it just kind of baffles me at times when these leaderships come back and be like, well, okay, maybe now we need to look into this. When you, like you said, you could have had an opportunity to do something about this from the get-go, put some strict boundaries in place for these schools to operate in, for the players to operate in, and not have to worry so much about it. I mean, I'm with you. I think if a player wants to sign something and sell it, he should be allowed to. If he wants to do appearances and get paid for them, I mean, that should be allowed to. One thing that I thought was interesting is when they talk about, affecting the college experience and the student athlete experience. The only thing I can think of on that front is, how does this happen? How is it affecting the locker room? You know what I mean? Like in the NFL, people always talk about, like the big money player, what does that do to the rest of the locker room with the guys that are making the minimum? The guy that's making the minimum, he's just happy to be making the minimum. He's not necessarily worried about the quarterback's contract when he's got his own contract to worry about. I can see that being a little bit different in college football when you've got guys that are walk-ons who nobody's ever heard of. And then you've got your quarterback, making millions. I think it takes a lot of like counseling from the coaching staff being like, hey, listen, this is just kind of the way it's going to be. And yeah, would it be great if you can make more? Sure. But I mean, nobody knows who you are. It's sad to say that this is kind of part of it. And to your point about, the donors or the big donor bases, being a bigger deal for these bigger schools and the more money that it's going to matter. The argument I keep having with people on Twitter, Facebook, wherever, is that like you look at most sports and the teams with the biggest payrolls don't always win. Like the Dodgers and the Yankees, they have the biggest payrolls. I mean, the Yankees haven't won a title in a decade or more. You look at, the NFL's got a salary cap, the NBA's got that luxury tax thing, but even the Lakers can't buy a championship right now. So I do think money matters. It absolutely does matter. We're seeing it with Texas A&M. We're seeing it with Texas. But I think there's it's similar to recruiting. Like the stars matter, but it's also what you do with those stars. It's what you do with those players that you bring in with NIL that's going to matter just as much. Like, do you develop those players into a championship team?
Yeah, no, development's always been a key. And to go back to your point, I don't honestly, I don't think that there is that kind of animosity. I mean, just go look at the kid who caught the game-winning 2-point conversion against Texas.
Yeah.
I mean, the next week he's shooting he's doing a NIL deal with Applebee's.
Right.
Jonathan Garibay at Texas Tech kicks that 62-yard field goal to beat Iowa State. What's he doing? He's getting a NIL deal right after that. I mean, so these guys are, I think it was with Church's Chicken, but it's a great opportunity for these guys. I don't think there's any animosity. They're just happy they're able to make a little bit of money. And it's just interesting to me because we had this whole NCAA thing and, with the college athletes not being able to make money. College athletes are the only kids on campus in college that aren't allowed to make money.
Right.
I mean, a student can make money, no problem. No, you can say, well, it's completely different with the athlete. No, it's not. The athlete is there on a scholarship. They're getting their tuition paid, but they've also got to bust their butt to keep that scholarship. And, they're working a lot harder in most cases because they have schoolwork, but they have training and having to study playbooks. And also, I don't get the reason why people are so against this. Now, and to go back to your point about the schools with the biggest payrolls or the biggest alumni bases, it's been going on for years.
Yeah.
It's just legal now.
Now it's in the light.
Yeah. What the old saying is, whatever happens in the dark comes to the light. I mean, that's really what it is. We've known about this. I mean, this goes back well beyond our time. I mean, we could go back to the Pony Express. I mean, it's been a part of college football for so long. That's why we have teams with NCAA sanctions every year because they're doing something, whether it's the Tennessee McDonald's bags of cash. I mean, they're all at some point or another, there is some shady business going on, but now they've made it legal. My biggest problem right now is not that they made it legal. It's that they're trying to put it back in the bottle because it's gotten to them. It's gotten out of hand. And so it's really interesting because as we know, the NCAA doesn't really have a whole lot of power. Yeah. Now they can rule people ineligible and keep them off field. Yes, they've done that. We've seen that on multiple times. But I think if push comes to shove, this is the time that we could see the separation of these Power 5 schools away from the NCAA. I think if push comes to shove, they could force the issue if it becomes an issue for these colleges.
Yeah, it makes me wonder how long we are for the NCAA as a governing body with college football playoff talk, expansion there with NIL. I mean, the conferences and the teams are really what hold the power in college football. And I mean, the NCAA kind of has to go along to get along. Now they're going to have to, they're going to look into this, and I bet they're going to come up with some guidelines and some boundaries that they're going to try to put in place and enforce, but it's going to be hard to put the cat back in the bag on this one. But it's going to be fascinating to watch. Patrick, we always appreciate having you on, giving us your insight. Make sure you go follow Patrick on Twitter at what are you now? You changed your Twitter handle so much, I can't keep up.
No, I changed it to Patrick Conn CFB because that's pretty much what I'm talking about. It's a lot of college football, some hoops, some baseball, but it's kind of, I'm all over the place on the college sports wire with USA Today Sports Media Group. So if you are a fan of any team, I'm likely going to talk about them at some point or another.
Yeah. So send all of your hate tweets to at Patrick Conn CFB on Twitter.
Oh, I'm used to that.
Yeah. I mean, aren't we all at this point? If you've been on Twitter long enough, you got a hate tweet. So it's been a lot of fun. We'll talk more about this as we get more details on college football playoff expansion and NIL down the road. For Patrick Conn, I'm John Williams. I'll catch you next time. Boomer Sooner.